She was nothing. They whispered, their words like poison in the air. Just another unnoticed shadow in the corner. Emily stood there, the weight of their judgments pressing on her chest. The ballroom, magnificent and grand, gleamed with opulence, its chandeliers hanging like frozen stars, casting a warm glow over the sea of high society. But to Emily, it was all just a blur of laughter and whispered insults, as she remained unseen, unnoticed by those who mattered. Her dress, elegant yet plain compared to the others, clung to her form with the quiet desperation of someone who had once belonged, but no longer did. She was the daughter of a fallen noble family, and no amount of effort could disguise the fact that she was out of place in this world of privilege. The laughter around her continued, but it was hollow, empty. She wasn't part of it. Her eyes drifted to the Duke, his presence cutting through the crowd like a blade. Duke Andrew Wentworth, tall, commanding, and impossibly cold. His every movement was a declaration of power, his gaze sweeping the room with an authority that silenced all around him. She watched as he passed by the other women, each one vying for his attention, each one desperate for the slightest favor, yet he didn't even glance at them. His expression remained unreadable, a perfect mask of control. For a moment, time seemed to slow as he passed her. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, the world around her fading into the background. She could feel the tension in the air, a palpable weight that pressed against her chest. And then, in a sudden, shocking motion, the Duke's eyes flicked toward her. It was brief, just a glance, but it was enough. Her heart stuttered. The room seemed to hold its breath. She blinked, certain she had imagined it. But no, his gaze remained fixed on her for one long, unyielding moment. Her hands trembled at her sides, the tips of her fingers barely brushing the fabric of her gown. This wasn't possible. She was no one. But there it was again, his gaze, sharp and focused, pulling her into his orbit. His eyes darkened as he took a step forward, his presence commanding the space between them. The room, once filled with idle chatter, grew eerily silent. Every head in the room turned as Duke Wentworth made his way toward her, his footsteps deliberate and measured. She could feel the weight of every eye upon her. They were watching, waiting. Her pulse quickened, her throat dry as she fought to steady herself. The Duke stopped just in front of her, towering over her like a force of nature. His eyes bored into hers, cold and impenetrable, and yet there was something in them, something that made her heart skip in her chest. And then, in the silence, he spoke. "You," he said, his voice like a low command, sharp and precise. "Come with me." His words hung in the air like an order, but it was more than that. It was an invitation. An invitation that she didn't deserve, an invitation that was meant for someone else. Someone more polished, more poised. Someone the world would accept. Not her. Not Emily. And yet, here he was, choosing her. The room erupted in a flurry of hushed whispers, the nobles' voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a cliff. Emily stood frozen, her mind scrambling to understand what was happening. She wasn't the woman the Duke should have chosen. She was an outsider, a ghost in this world of elegance and privilege. But the Duke's eyes never wavered, and his hand, cold and firm, reached for hers. In that moment, the world seemed to disappear. There was only the Duke, and there was only her. No one else mattered. She could feel the cold metal of his ring brush against her skin as he took her hand, leading her away from the crowd. As they walked, the whispers followed them, a constant reminder of her unworthiness. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the Duke, the powerful man who had just chosen her. The whispers, the doubts, the fears, they all faded into the background as he led her into the unknown. A new world. Her heart raced, her body trembling under the weight of his touch, but she couldn't help the tiny spark of hope that ignited within her. The Duke had chosen her, and now, nothing would ever be the same. The Duke's grip on Emily's hand was firm, but not forceful. It was a subtle command, guiding her through the maze of nobles, who parted like the Red Sea at his approach. His presence was a shadow that cast everything else into darkness. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as they walked. She could feel the heat of his body close to hers, but she dared not look at him. Instead, her eyes remained fixed ahead, the marble floors gleaming beneath their feet. The weight of the silence between them was suffocating. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the ballroom had turned into an ocean and she was drowning in it. She could hear the whispers trailing behind her, their words like daggers in her back. What does he see in her? She's nothing compared to the others. The cruel thoughts filled her mind, but she could do nothing but walk, the Duke's hands still holding hers, a constant reminder of the shift in her fate. The room seemed to spin around her, the laughter and chatter fading into a dull hum as they reached the far corner of the ballroom. There, the Duke finally stopped, turning to face her. He released her hand, and for a moment, Emily felt a cold emptiness where his touch had been. His gaze was unwavering. Those piercing eyes locked onto hers with such intensity, it almost took her breath away. "You've been invisible your entire life, haven't you?" His voice was low, but the words sliced through the silence with startling clarity. Emily flinched, her pulse quickening. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't that she hadn't been prepared for this moment. It was that she had never expected him to see her. To see her for real. All this time, you've been living in the shadow of others, watching from the sidelines, never once thinking you could have a place here. His words were sharp, but they didn't sting. Instead, they opened something inside her, something buried deep. A long-buried feeling of longing, of wanting to be seen, to be chosen. She had been nothing. But now, in the face of this Duke's quiet, but undeniable attention, she was something. Or at least, she might be. The Duke took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, like a storm about to break. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to step back, but her feet refused to move. "What do you want from me?" She finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The Duke's lips curled into the faintest of smirks. "I want you to stop hiding, Emily." His use of her name made her heart race. She had never imagined he would know her name, let alone speak it with such certainty. It was as if he had unlocked something within her, a truth she had been too afraid to face. He reached out, not to touch her, but to adjust a loose strand of hair that had fallen from her carefully pinned-up do. The touch was so subtle, so fleeting, and yet it burned through her. His fingers brushed the side of her face, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to freeze. She couldn't breathe. The grand ballroom around them, every single person in that room, seemed to vanish. There was only the Duke. Only his hand, now resting just inches from her face, the heat of his touch still lingering. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, but no less commanding. "You've spent your life as nothing but a reflection of others. It's time you saw yourself as I see you." Emily swallowed hard, her mind spinning. How could he see her? She was nothing like the women around her, those who wore their titles like crowns, who had everything handed to them on silver platters. She had no wealth, no family name left to speak of. She was a shadow, but in the Duke's eyes, there was something else. Something that made her feel as if she could rise from the ashes of her past. Something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. She opened her mouth, but before she could say a word, the Duke stepped back, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, a heavy weight that Emily could hardly bear. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty ballroom. He didn't look back. Emily stood there, her body frozen, her mind racing. What had just happened? She was no longer sure where she stood in this world. She had been chosen, and yet, she had no idea what came next. She only knew one thing for certain. Her life had just changed, in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The silence that followed the Duke's departure felt like an eternity. Emily stood frozen, the weight of his gaze still lingering in the air around her. The grand ballroom, now devoid of the Duke's presence, felt colder, emptier, as if the room itself had lost its life. The murmurs from the nobles slowly began to swell, their words a cruel undercurrent to the already overwhelming silence she was drowning in. She was the talk of the evening now, the one who had caught the attention of Duke Andrew Wentworth. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean that he had chosen her? She had lived her whole life in the shadows, a mere reflection of the people around her, never truly seen. But now she was seen, and it terrified her. Her heart was still pounding, her breath shallow, as she turned to leave the ballroom. The marble floor beneath her feet seemed to shift with every step, her mind racing to catch up with the reality of what had just happened. She needed air. She needed to breathe. As she stepped into the grand corridor, the cool night air met her, offering a fleeting moment of respite. But it was short-lived. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into her path with quiet precision. It was him, the Duke. His presence was impossible to ignore. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace, his every step echoing through the silence like a drumbeat. He was closer now, so much closer than she had ever expected. She took a step back, her pulse racing again, but he didn't stop. His gaze, still sharp and unwavering, held her in place, like a force beyond her control. Emily. He said her name like it was a command, like it was the only thing that mattered in this moment. His voice was low, yet powerful, and it sent a shiver down her spine. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, yet alive in a way she had never felt before. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was caught in the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "I've chosen you," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of undeniable truth. The Duke had made his decision. She was the one. And yet, she still couldn't comprehend it. She had been invisible her whole life, a mere shadow in the eyes of those who mattered. And now, here she was, standing in front of the most powerful man in England, chosen by him. Her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and excitement. The power dynamic between them was palpable, crackling in the air like electricity. He was the Duke, impossible to ignore, impossible to resist. And she was nothing. Or was she? The question lingered in her mind, unanswered, as the Duke reached out and gently placed his hand on her arm. His touch was light, but it sent a shock through her body, making her breath hitch. The coldness of his hand contrasted with the warmth of her skin, but it was a welcome feeling. His fingers were firm, yet there was a tenderness in his touch that made her heart race even more. "You are more than you believe," he said, his voice soft, but with an edge to it. "You will see that soon enough." The tension between them grew thicker, the air charged with the weight of his words. Emily could barely breathe. She was caught in the storm that was this man, his power and influence enveloping her in a way she couldn't explain. She had been chosen, but what did that mean for her? What would he want from her? Her thoughts spun, each one faster than the last. The Duke's gaze softened, but only slightly. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper. She couldn't quite place it, but it was there, beneath the surface. "I'm not what you think," she said quietly, almost as if trying to convince herself. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think I think?" he asked, his tone challenging, yet curious. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That she was a nobody, a woman who had been forgotten by society? That she had no place among the powerful and the wealthy? She wasn't sure anymore. The Duke's hand, still resting on her arm, tightened ever so slightly, pulling her back from her spiraling thoughts. "You are more than that," he repeated, his voice now a little firmer. "You have always been more. Now, you will see it for yourself." Emily looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always known that there was something more to her, something waiting to be unlocked. But she had never imagined it would come from him, from a man like him, the Duke of Wentworth. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly swallowed by the reality of her situation. She was still the same woman she had always been, the daughter of a fallen family, with nothing to offer. And yet, here he was, standing before her, offering her a chance to become something more than she ever thought possible. The power dynamic between them was shifting, the roles they had always played, master and servant, noble and commoner, no longer holding the same weight. She was no longer invisible. Not to him, not to the Duke. Emily's heart was racing, the pulse in her throat hammering as she stood frozen before the Duke, his words echoing in her mind like a distant drumbeat. His gaze was still intense, like a force she couldn't escape, pulling her deeper into his world. She had always been the outsider, the one ignored, dismissed, and now she was the focus of every noble eye in the room. It wasn't just his touch, or his words, but the shift in the very air around them. The Duke had chosen her, and that choice, that small but monumental gesture, had shattered everything. The ballroom, once full of laughter and conversation, now felt like a prison of eyes, all trained on her, all judging her. She could feel their gaze like fire, hot and burning. "What do you think they'll say about you?" The Duke's voice, low and commanding, brought her back to the present. His eyes locked onto hers, the intensity never wavering. "You've never been more than a shadow, Emily." But now, he stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until it was just the two of them, standing alone in the center of the grand room. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, a silent tension building with every passing second. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was as if her voice had been stolen by the weight of the moment. His hand, still lingering on her arm, tightened slightly, not in force, but in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "You can't hide anymore," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not from me. Not from anyone." She wanted to pull away, to escape, to run from the suffocating pressure of the Duke's presence. But something deep inside her, kept her rooted to the spot. Was it fear? Desire? Or the dawning realization that this moment, this single moment, could change everything? "You think you're nothing," he continued, his voice now a little colder. "But you're wrong." His words sliced through her like a sharp knife, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as the invisible woman she had always been, but as someone worthy of attention. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say, or if she even had the right to speak at all. The Duke's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, but there was no warmth in it. There was only the cold certainty of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. Light, so fleeting, it could have been a figment of her imagination. The touch sent a jolt through her, a spark of electricity that traveled from her skin to the depths of her heart. "Because," he said, his voice low and steady, "you've been hiding in plain sight for too long." And with that, he turned, his movements graceful and deliberate, as if he were a predator watching his prey, each step bringing him further away from her. But the power between them didn't fade. It lingered, thick and oppressive, like a storm about to break. As the Duke walked away, Emily remained rooted to the spot, her body still trembling from the briefest of touches. She had been chosen. She had been seen. But now, more than ever, she had no idea what came next. The room around her seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder, but it was the Duke's final words that reverberated in her mind. "You've been hiding, but not anymore." She couldn't escape the weight of those words, the promise of a power shift she wasn't sure she was ready for. The ballroom had never felt so small, so suffocating, as she watched the Duke's retreating figure. She was caught between two worlds, the one she had always known, the world of shadows and whispers, and the one he was offering her, the world of power and desire, where everything was about to change. She could feel it, the shift, the tremor in the air, the tension that would not be denied. And now, there was no turning back. The tension in the ballroom was palpable, thick as smoke, curling around Emily's body as she stood in the midst of it all. The Duke's words from earlier still lingered in the air, his presence casting a shadow over everything. She couldn't escape it. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of it all. How had it come to this? She was still the same woman, the daughter of a disgraced family, nothing more than a shadow in the eyes of society. And yet, Duke Wentworth had chosen her. His eyes had been so certain, his touch so brief yet so intense, as if he were claiming her, marking her as his, as if she were something worth having. The noise of the ballroom, once so loud, faded into the background as Emily's thoughts consumed her. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the laughter, all of it vanished, and all she could hear was the thudding of her own heartbeat. Words were a command, but there was something more to them, something that cut through her, carving a place for her in his world. Emily's throat tightened as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That she was nothing? That she didn't belong? Or that she feared the power he held over her? But the Duke didn't wait for an answer. He stepped closer still, his body pressing against hers, his presence overwhelming. The tension in the air between them thickened, as if everything else in the room had melted away. The whispers around them grew louder, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from another world. The only thing that mattered now was the Duke and the space between them, the power he held, the control he exuded. Emily could feel the eyes of the nobles on her, their judgment seeping into her skin like a cold chill. But none of that mattered now. None of it. The Duke's hand, still resting on her wrist, tightened ever so slightly, and she felt herself leaning into him, drawn by an invisible force she couldn't escape. It was as if he were pulling her closer to him with every passing second, and she could do nothing to resist. His gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he surveyed her. "You think you have no place in this world," he murmured, his voice rough with something she couldn't place. "But you're wrong. You do. You always have." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, but they were not cruel. They were the truth, and it was that truth that shook her to her core. She was not invisible anymore. She wasn't just the daughter of a fallen family. She wasn't nothing. The Duke had chosen her, and that choice was more powerful than anything she had ever known. But there was more. There was always more. The tension between them was building, thick and palpable, until Emily thought she might suffocate under its weight. And then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible motion, the Duke leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. His words were like fire, igniting something deep within her that she didn't fully understand. The space between them had shifted once more, and now, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it. The shift in power, the change in their dynamic. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was the chosen one, the one who had caught the Duke's attention. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with a quiet but undeniable force that pulled at Emily's very soul. The Duke's presence was overwhelming, not just in his size or his authority, but in the weight of the moment. He had claimed her in a way she couldn't fully understand, and now, as she stood before him, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner of the ballroom. She was the one he had chosen, the one he had set his eyes upon, and that knowledge felt like a burden she was not sure she could bear. The room around her was a blur, the whispers of the nobles fading into a dull hum, but all she could hear was the beating of her own heart, racing as she stood there, facing him. The Duke's eyes never left hers, and with every second that passed, the distance between them grew smaller. His gaze was like fire, searing into her, leaving nothing untouched. And she felt it, every inch of it. She could feel the way her pulse quickened when he took a step closer, the way her breath caught in her chest as he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. He was a storm, a force she couldn't escape, and every part of her body screamed for her to step back, but she couldn't. His fingers grazed the side of her cheek, and the contact was a shock, a jolt that ran through her like lightning. She froze, unable to move, her body suddenly betraying her as she leaned into his touch, not out of choice, but because something deep within her wanted to feel it. The Duke's hand was cool against her skin, but there was power in it, in the way he controlled the space between them, in the way he made her feel like everything else around her was irrelevant. She was caught in his orbit, unable to escape, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to. "You think you understand power, don't you?" he murmured, his voice low, almost a growl, and it sent a shiver down her spine. His breath was warm against her ear as he spoke, and she could feel the weight of his words, the truth behind them. "You think that because you've been overlooked, that you've been dismissed, that you are nothing. But you are wrong." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The Duke stepped back, his eyes still locked on hers, but this time there was something else in them, something colder, more calculating. He was not just speaking to her, he was measuring her, testing her. Emily's mind spun as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had never been in control of anything in her life. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, who had to fight for every ounce of attention she received. And yet, here she was, standing before the most powerful man in England, and he was giving her something she had never known, the attention she had always craved. But it wasn't just attention, it was something much more dangerous. It was the power to change everything. The Duke didn't speak again, but his gaze never wavered, and Emily could feel the pressure building between them, the unspoken tension that hung like a thread between them, pulling tighter and tighter. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel her chest tightening, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never been this close to someone so powerful, so assured of their own place in the world, and it terrified her. But more than that, it excited her. The Duke took a step back, breaking the spell between them, and for the first time since they had come together, Emily could breathe again. But the air was thick with something else now, something she couldn't name. He was standing just a few feet away, his posture still imposing, his gaze still fixed on her, but there was a shift in the air. The power dynamic had changed again, and this time, it was not just a subtle shift, it was a full-fledged storm. "You belong here," the Duke said, his voice steady, commanding. The words were not a question. They were a declaration. "And I will make sure that everyone knows it." The finality in his tone sent a shiver through her, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. She was caught between two worlds, the one she had always known, where she was invisible, and the one the Duke was offering her, where everything was about to change. She had always been an outsider, never truly a part of the world of the nobility, always looking in from the outside. But now, as the Duke stood before her, those walls were beginning to crumble. And the question that had been haunting her since that first moment he had chosen her, the question of what came next, was now looming larger than ever. She wanted to resist. She wanted to push him away, to step back into the shadows where she felt safe. But there was no going back. The Duke had made his choice, and now, she had to face whatever came next. His eyes never left hers, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the room, the rest of the world, had disappeared. There was only him, and her, and the unspoken promise that hovered between them, thick and heavy, like a storm that had yet to break. The tension in the air was suffocating as Emily stood before the Duke, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. The ballroom around her had become a distant blur, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading into the background. All that mattered was the Duke, standing just inches away, his gaze still fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to her very soul. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. And yet, at the same time, she had never felt more alive. The weight of his attention was heavy, like an anchor pulling her down into a world she didn't understand. But there was no turning back now. The Duke had chosen her, and nothing in her life had ever felt so certain. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." The Duke's voice broke through the silence, low and controlled, sending a shiver down her spine. His words were not a threat, but a warning, and they were far from comforting. He was a man of power, a man who ruled over everything and everyone in this room, and she was a mere pawn in his game. But that didn't stop her heart from racing. "Do you think you're ready for this?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if testing her. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That she was ready? That she could handle whatever he had in mind for her? She wasn't even sure what this was. But she knew one thing for certain. She could never go back to the life she had before. Not after this moment. Not after him. The Duke stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming, his hand reaching out to gently tilt her chin upward so that she had no choice but to meet his gaze. The coldness of his touch sent a shock through her, and her body instinctively tensed, but he didn't let go. He held her there, his fingers resting on her jaw, as though claiming her in a way that no one ever had before. "I chose you for a reason," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "But make no mistake, Emily, this is not a game." The weight of his words hit her like a thunderclap, and for a moment, she felt like she was drowning in the storm that was his presence. She had always been overlooked, always been the invisible one, the one who was dismissed by everyone around her. But now, the Duke's eyes were on her, and in this moment, she was the center of his world. She was everything. The realization sent a rush of warmth through her, and yet the coldness of his touch kept her grounded in reality. He was a man of power, and she was nothing more than a woman caught in the current of his desires. His fingers tightened just slightly, pulling her closer to him, and she could feel the heat radiating off of his body. She could feel the power that radiated from him, that magnetic force that seemed to draw her in and leave her breathless. "You will do as I say," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "And you will learn your place in this world, whether you like it or not." The words struck her like a blow to the chest, and, for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She wanted to protest, to fight back, but the truth was, she couldn't. She didn't know how. She had never known how to fight against a force like this. The Duke stepped back then, his hands slipping from her chin, and the moment of intimacy was gone. But the air between them still crackled with unspoken tension, a tension that had only just begun to rise. She could feel it, the shift in the power dynamic between them, the way everything had changed with a single glance, a single touch. The ballroom seemed to have closed in on her, the walls pressing down with the weight of society's expectations. She could feel their eyes on her, the nobles watching with bated breath, waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to fall back into the shadows where she belonged. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. The Duke had given her something powerful, something that she couldn't quite grasp but could feel in the deepest part of her. He had chosen her, and now she had to prove herself worthy of that choice. The world around her seemed to shift again, the ground beneath her feet uncertain, but there was no turning back. Not now. She had already crossed the line, and the only way forward was into the unknown. The Duke turned away, his broad shoulders disappearing into the crowd, and Emily was left standing there, still trying to steady her breath, her heart racing in her chest. She had never felt more alone, and yet she had never felt so alive. The game had changed, the rules had shifted, and she was about to find out just how deep this game went. The silence around her grew deafening, the weight of society's expectations pressing down harder, the whispers of the noble women floating like daggers in the air. But she didn't care. Not anymore. The Duke had chosen her, and now she was his. A part of her wondered if she had any say in this, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was in it now, and there was no going back. The ballroom was a storm of whispers, the tension crackling in the air like static before a lightning strike. Emily stood at the center of it all, her heart thudding in her chest, her body still trembling from the Duke's presence. The room was alive with movement, yet she felt frozen in time. The Duke had chosen her, and that choice had turned everything upside down. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her, their gazes heavy and scrutinizing, like vultures waiting for her to falter. She had been nothing, just a shadow in the world of the noble elite. But now, she was at the center of their attention, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She could feel the Duke's eyes on her even from across the room, his gaze like a weight she could not escape. The distance between them was physical, but it felt like a chasm, vast and insurmountable. Yet, there was no doubt in her mind that he was watching, waiting, measuring her. His power was undeniable, and he had already shifted the world around her. But Emily was no longer the woman she had been moments ago. She could feel it, deep inside her. The way the air felt different now that she had been seen, truly seen, by a man of such power. And yet, there was a coldness to it all, a harsh reminder that she was still not truly part of his world. The Duke's command over the room was absolute, and no matter how much she wanted to resist, no matter how much she longed to retreat into the shadows, she knew she couldn't. He had made his choice, and with it, her life had been irrevocably altered. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, the Duke's voice cut through the noise of the ballroom, sharp and commanding. Emily. His voice was a low command, but it was all it took to pull her from her reverie. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned, her gaze meeting his. He was standing at the far side of the room, his presence so commanding that the air itself seemed to bend around him. He didn't move, but his gaze locked onto hers, unyielding, unblinking. She could feel it, the power that radiated from him, filling the space between them. It was a force that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk toward her. The crowd parted before him, the noble women shrinking back in his wake, their gazes filled with envy and suspicion. The world around them seemed to blur, the noise fading as Emily's heart began to race. He was coming for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As he drew closer, the tension in the room became palpable, a tightrope pulled taut between them. His eyes never left hers, and the distance between them closed with every step. The space around her seemed to shrink until all she could see, all she could feel, was him. The Duke stopped just in front of her, his towering presence filling her vision, his gaze intense and unwavering. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, an electricity that left Emily breathless. His eyes scanned her face, but there was no softness in his gaze. It was a look of calculation, of control. She was no longer the invisible woman she had been. She was here, in the center of his world, and she felt the weight of it. "You're nervous," the Duke said, his voice low, his tone almost a whisper. The words sent a shiver down her spine, and she clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady herself. "You should be," he continued, his gaze flicking briefly to her trembling hands before returning to her face. "I am not a man you can simply walk away from." His words were cold, but there was an edge of something else beneath them, something darker, something that made her skin prickle with both fear and excitement. His hand reached out then, slow and deliberate, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as his fingers brushed against her arm. The touch was light, but the power behind it was undeniable. It was as if he were marking her, claiming her in some silent way that only the two of them understood. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke's touch lingered, and Emily could feel the eyes of every guest on them, watching, waiting. She wanted to pull away, to break the connection, but she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, caught in the storm of his presence, and all she could do was stand there and feel it. "You have no idea what you're getting into," the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper, his breath warm against her ear. "But you'll learn soon enough." His words sent a chill through her, but they were not filled with malice. They were simply a statement of fact, a fact that she would have to come to terms with. The Duke stepped back then, his hand falling away from her arm, and the sudden loss of his touch left Emily feeling exposed, like a part of her had been taken away. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way everything had shifted between them. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner of the room. She was his, and that knowledge, that realization, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The Duke's eyes never wavered as he stepped back, his gaze still fixed on her, calculating, assessing. The world around her was still, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the Duke, the power he held over her, the power he had given her, and the power she was about to lose. The ballroom was no longer the place of celebration it had once been. It was a stage, and she was the center of it, the focal point of everything the Duke had set into motion. And there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The ballroom, once a place of festivity and laughter, had transformed into a battlefield of silent whispers and charged glances. Emily stood at the center of it all, her chest rising and falling with the rapid rhythm of her heartbeat. The Duke's words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, relentless and unyielding. "You will learn your place in this world." The pressure of his gaze, so cold and calculating, was almost unbearable. She could feel it like a weight on her shoulders, dragging her down, forcing her to confront the truth she had tried to hide from her entire life. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner, dismissed by the world around her. No, now, she was the center of it all, a pawn in a game she barely understood, a game that had only just begun. The room felt as if it were closing in around her, the laughter and conversation now drowned out by the pounding of her own pulse. The Duke had chosen her, and with that choice, everything had shifted. The nobles watched with bated breath, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, but Emily couldn't focus on them. She couldn't focus on anything but the Duke. He was the storm, the calm at its eye, and she was caught in its path. He had promised her a place in his world, but she wasn't sure if she wanted it. His power was undeniable, and the force of his will was almost suffocating. But she was drawn to it, drawn to him, in a way she couldn't explain. She had always been told she was nothing, but now, standing before him, she was something. She wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The Duke moved then, slow and deliberate, his steps echoing in the now silent room. Every eye followed him, but Emily couldn't tear her gaze away. He was closing the distance between them, and with each step, the air between them grew heavier. He stopped just in front of her, his towering presence making her feel small and insignificant, yet at the same time, seen. His eyes locked onto hers, a silent challenge hanging in the air between them. "You think you understand power," the Duke said, his voice low, dangerous, his words slicing through the tension like a knife. "But you don't." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she tried to speak, but the words were trapped, caught in the web of emotions that tangled inside her. She wanted to argue, to push back against him, but she couldn't. She wasn't sure she had the strength. His presence was overwhelming, his authority so absolute that it crushed her ability to think clearly. "You're nothing," the Duke continued, his voice turning colder, harder. "You think you can play in my world, but you're just a game piece, a toy to be used and discarded." The words struck her like a blow, but there was something else in them, a challenge, a dare. His gaze never wavered, and Emily could feel the weight of it. "But that can change," he said, his eyes narrowing, the corners of his lips curling into a smirk. "If you prove yourself worthy." The tension between them was thick now, the air crackling with the intensity of the moment. Emily was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. She had never felt so small, so insignificant, and yet, in the Duke's eyes, she also felt something else, something dangerous. Power. A flicker of defiance surged in her chest, but it was quickly suppressed by the overwhelming weight of the situation. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she was more than just a pawn. But the words wouldn't come. The Duke took a step closer, his body pressing against hers, the heat of him invading her space. The scent of him, sharp, intoxicating, seemed to wrap around her, and she couldn't escape it. His breath was warm against her ear, and his hand, so light and yet commanding, brushed the back of her neck, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. "You think you know who you are," he murmured, his voice so low, it was almost a growl. "But you don't. Not yet." The words sent a wave of heat through her, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She was caught between two worlds, the world she had always known, where she was invisible, and the world the Duke was offering her, a world where everything could change. She was trembling now, her body betraying her, responding to the Duke's proximity in ways she didn't understand. His fingers gently grazed her skin, and the touch was electric, making her skin burn. Her pulse quickened, and she couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else. Something deeper, something that terrified her. The Duke stepped back suddenly, breaking the moment between them, but the tension didn't dissipate. No, it hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and Emily could feel it pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath her feet uncertain, and she felt a rush of emotions, confusion, fear, desire, all swirling together. She had been nothing. She had been dismissed, ignored. But now, in the Duke's eyes, she was something. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know what she was supposed to do with it. But one thing was certain. She could never go back to the life she had before. The power dynamic had shifted, and Emily was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. She was a part of this world now, whether she liked it or not. The Duke's eyes locked onto hers once more, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt something else, something that both thrilled and terrified her. The question that had been gnawing at her, the question of what she was truly worth, hung in the air between them, unanswered. And she knew, deep down, that it would never be answered. Not until she stepped fully into the storm the Duke had set in motion. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, the silence between them now stretching like a taut rope, ready to snap. Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as she faced the Duke. The power in his gaze was undeniable, and the room around them seemed to fade into nothingness. There was only him, only the weight of his presence, and the growing tension that clung to the space between them like a living thing. Every step he took toward her was deliberate, slow, and as he moved, the room seemed to hold its breath. His eyes never left hers, sharp and calculating, and for a moment, Emily felt like she was being stripped bare, exposed to him in a way that made her skin crawl and tingle all at once. The Duke reached out, his hand brushing her arm, and the touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. It wasn't the gentleness of his fingers that made her heart race, but the force of the power he wielded with such ease. His touch, though light, held a weight that anchored her in place, as though her very existence depended on it. The world around them disappeared, the nobles, the whispers, the music, all of it faded as she was pulled into his orbit, into the web of power he had woven around them both. His fingers trailed lightly down her arm, sending a shiver through her that she couldn't suppress. "You think you know what this is, don't you?" he said, his voice low. almost a whisper, but the force of it struck her like a blow. You think that because I've chosen you, you understand the game. But you don't. His words hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from her lungs. She had thought she understood. She had thought that being chosen by him meant something, but now she wasn't so sure. He was a man who had power, a man who ruled with an iron fist, and she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. The Duke's grip on her arm tightened ever so slightly, pulling her closer, forcing her to meet his gaze once more. His eyes, dark and fathomless, searched her face as if looking for something only he could see. You're nothing to me, Emily, he said, his voice soft but filled with the weight of finality. You're just a means to an end, a tool I will use to get what I want. The words stung, cutting through her like a sharp blade. She had always known she was nothing, always known that she was invisible in the eyes of society. But to hear the Duke say it, to hear him confirm it in such a cold, dismissive tone, shattered something deep inside her. The power she had once felt, the excitement at being chosen, evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only the cold, harsh truth. She had been a fool. The Duke was not interested in her for who she was. He was interested in her because she was a way to further his own ambitions. And the realization hit her harder than she had ever expected. She had been used. The anger bubbled up from deep within her, surging like a wave ready to crash. She had been nothing but a tool, a puppet in his hands. The realization tore through her, and for the first time, she saw him for who he truly was, not the powerful, commanding man she had once admired, but a man who used others to get what he wanted, who cared for no one but himself. You think I don't see through you? She whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was enough. The Duke's gaze faltered for a split second, his eyes flickering with something that might have been surprise. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He stepped back, his expression unreadable once more, and the space between them seemed to widen. You're wrong, he said, his voice low, but the coldness in it sent a chill through her. You have no idea what you're dealing with. His words were like ice, and the finality of them sent a shiver down her spine. He was not the man she had thought he was. He was not the Duke who had chosen her, who had made her feel important, feel seen. He was the Duke who would discard her when she was no longer useful. And in that moment, everything changed. The power dynamic that had once seemed so clear, so absolute, had shifted. The Duke was no longer the one in control. Emily could feel it now. The change, the shift in the air, the way the room around her seemed to freeze in place. She was no longer the pawn. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. The Duke had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. And now, it was her turn. I don't need you, she said, her voice steady, louder than she had ever spoken before, and the words felt like a weight lifting off her chest. The Duke's eyes narrowed, but Emily stood her ground. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't the woman who had trembled before him, the woman who had been invisible. She was someone else now. She had learned, had seen through his facade, and now, she would no longer let him control her. The moment hung in the air, charged with an energy that threatened to shatter everything. She stepped back, putting distance between them, and the Duke didn't move to stop her. Instead, he stood there, watching her, the mask of control slipping slightly. The room had shifted, the power had shifted, and Emily had found something she hadn't realized she had. Strength. The Duke had thought he could break her, use her, but she was stronger than he had imagined. And as she walked away from him, the silence in the room was deafening. She wasn't going to be his pawn anymore. She was going to play her own game. The tension in the room was palpable, thick like a storm cloud about to burst. Emily stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced the Duke. His gaze was colder than ever, a calculating force that pierced through her, searching for something that, for a fleeting moment, she couldn't quite understand. Everything had led to this, the choices she had made, the power she had fought for, and the revelations she had unearthed about herself. She wasn't the invisible woman she had been, nor was she the pawn the Duke had thought her to be. The power had shifted, and it was now in her hands. But the cost of this shift, of standing here, of confronting him, was more than she had ever imagined. You've made a mistake, Emily, the Duke said, his voice low and filled with a harsh finality that made her blood run cold. The words should have shaken her, but instead, They ignited something deep inside of her. The anger, the hurt, everything she had bottled up for so long. The injustice of it all finally came to a head. She stood taller, her shoulders square, her hands clenched at her sides. She would not let him see her falter. She would not let him take back what he had given her, no matter how much he tried to reclaim control. A mistake, she repeated, her voice steady but fierce. No, Duke. The mistake was thinking you could break me. The words left her lips with such force, such conviction, that they felt like a declaration, a challenge. The Duke's eyes narrowed as if he hadn't expected this, as if her defiance was something foreign to him. He took a step toward her, his presence overwhelming. But this time, Emily didn't move. She stood her ground, the silence between them vibrating with tension. You still don't understand, he said, his voice cold, almost amused. You think that because you've made some bold decisions, because you've stood up to me, that you've won. But you haven't. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm in a gesture that was meant to assert dominance. But Emily didn't flinch. The contact, instead of causing her to shrink, only fueled the fire inside her. She met his gaze, unwavering. The only thing you've done, she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet fury, is reveal your own weakness. You thought you could control me, manipulate me, but you were wrong. The words hung in the air between them, thick with a challenge that neither could ignore. The Duke's expression darkened, but there was something else there, something beneath the surface, a flicker of doubt. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Emily saw it. And in that moment, something shifted in her. She wasn't the woman who had cowered in the shadows. She wasn't the one who had been cast aside. She was the one who had learned, who had grown, who had finally realized the strength within her. The power dynamic had shifted in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The Duke had underestimated her, and now, it was too late for him to take back the control he had lost. His grip on her arm tightened again, but this time, she didn't react. Instead, she met his gaze and stood still, as if to show him that she no longer feared him, no longer feared the power he held. Let go of me, she said, her voice a command, not a plea. His eyes flickered with something she couldn't place. Anger, frustration, but something else too. A shift, a recognition of the change in their relationship. But instead of pulling back, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, You think this is over? You think you've won? The air between them was thick with unresolved tension, and for a moment, Emily was unsure of how to respond. She could feel his body so close to hers, the strength of him, the power that still lingered in the space between them. But something inside her told her that this was the moment when everything changed. I don't need you, she said softly, the words sharp in their finality. The Duke's eyes darkened further, but he didn't respond. The tension between them was almost unbearable now, the power shift so complete that it left Emily breathless. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on them, watching, waiting for the next move, but Emily didn't care anymore. The power was hers now, and she was no longer afraid of the Duke, of his control, of his influence. She had found her strength, and in that moment, it was more powerful than anything he could offer her. You've underestimated me, she said, her voice low, but filled with a certainty that made the Duke falter, just for a split second. The room seemed to hold its breath as Emily took a step back, breaking the invisible connection between them, and the Duke didn't stop her. He didn't try to pull her back into his orbit. Instead, he stood there, his gaze locked onto hers, the realization sinking in. He had lost. The power had shifted, and it was no longer his. Emily had done it. She had taken control of her own fate, and for the first time, she felt free. The Duke's eyes, once so full of authority and control, were now filled with something else, something darker, something like respect. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The game had changed, and now, Emily was the one in charge. The tension in the room was electric, thick with the weight of unspoken words and the knowledge that the moment had finally arrived. Emily stood before the Duke, her heart pounding in her chest, the room around them almost entirely silent except for the rhythmic echo of her own breath. She had confronted him, faced the reality of who he was and who she had become in his world, and now, everything was about to shift again. The Duke stood across from her, his posture rigid, His eyes locked onto hers with a mixture of frustration and admiration. There was something different in his gaze now, something deeper, more complex. The power that had once been so clearly in his hands, so firmly wrapped around both of them, was no longer just his. It was in the air, in the space between them, and Emily could feel it as if it were a tangible force, pushing and pulling in equal measure. "You think you can walk away from this?" the Duke said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but still carrying the weight of command. His words hung between them like a challenge, but there was something in his tone, something softer, that made Emily pause. She had seen this man as a force, a wall of power that nothing could breach, but now she saw the cracks in that wall. She saw the uncertainty that had begun to seep through, the realization that his control was slipping, and it was more powerful than anything she had ever felt. She straightened, her gaze never wavering from his, as she took a step forward. Her movements were deliberate, the click of her heels against the marble floor sounding louder than it should have been in the stillness of the room. The crowd had faded into the background. All that mattered now was the Duke and the space between them. He didn't step back, didn't move to close the gap, and for a brief moment, Emily wondered if he was testing her, if he was waiting to see what she would do next. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room on her, but she didn't look at them. She only had eyes for him. "I don't need your permission to exist in your world," Emily said, her voice steady, strong, carrying the weight of everything she had learned in this whirlwind of power and control. The Duke's eyes flickered, just for a second, and in that moment, Emily saw it, the shift, the realization that she had taken back control, that she had stepped into her own power. He was no longer the figure that towered over her, that dictated her every move. She was standing on equal ground now, her strength no longer hidden in the shadows. The silence stretched between them, thick with the aftermath of their words, and then, with a swift motion, the Duke reached out, his hand gripping her wrist with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. For a moment, she felt trapped again, caught in his grasp, but then something inside her stirred, something defiant, something that refused to be controlled. She pulled back, not violently, but with purpose, and the Duke's grip loosened, though his eyes never left hers. The tension between them was almost unbearable now, a storm ready to break. "You've always been the one to hold the power," Emily said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "But now I understand. I know the game we've been playing." She could feel the air shift around them as she spoke, the power dynamic between them visibly changing. The Duke's expression softened, just a fraction, and Emily could almost see the struggle within him. He had never anticipated this. He had never expected her to rise up, to challenge him, and yet here they were, both standing at the precipice of something neither of them could fully control. The Duke took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing slightly as he let her words settle. "You think this is some game," he said, his voice low, a hint of admiration in it now. "But this is not about power, Emily. This is about control. My control." His words hit her like a wave, but Emily didn't flinch. She had already crossed that line. She had already taken the first step toward her own freedom. "Then you've lost it," she replied, her voice unwavering. "You've lost control." The finality of her words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, she saw something shift in the Duke, something that looked like acceptance, maybe even respect. He stepped back then, his posture still tense, but his eyes no longer held the same intensity. Instead, they were watching her, studying her, as if seeing her for the first time. Emily could feel the power shifting, ebbing away from him, but it wasn't because she had taken it. It was because he had given it to her. He had underestimated her, and now, he was seeing her for who she truly was, someone not easily controlled, someone who could stand toe-to-toe with him and face him down. The room was still, the tension hanging in the air, but Emily could feel the weight lifting. She had done it. She had claimed her place, not as a pawn in the Duke's game, but as a player in her own right. The Duke's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, but then he turned, his movements calm, almost resigned. As he walked away, Emily stood there, her chest rising and falling with the rush of adrenaline. The power had shifted, but not in the way the Duke had expected. She wasn't his to control anymore. She was her own, and nothing would ever be the same. The Duke's figure stood at the far end of the grand hall, his silhouette framed by the soft light filtering through the tall windows. Emily remained in the center of the room, the weight of everything she had endured pressing down on her chest. But there was something else now, something that felt like relief, or perhaps liberation. The power that had once been his, so clearly defined and absolute, was slipping away, and the room around them seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The guests who had once whispered about her, who had dismissed her, were now silent, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The Duke had always been the one in control, the powerful force that commanded respect and fear alike. But now, in the quiet aftermath of their confrontation, Emily could feel the shift. The battle for power between them had finally come to an end, and she had emerged victorious. The tension that had built up between them over the last few weeks seemed to dissipate, leaving in its wake a strange, uncomfortable calm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The Duke stood still, his back turned to her, but Emily could feel his presence, as powerful as ever. She could hear his breath, steady and deep, and the soft rustle of his clothing as he shifted ever so slightly. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the oppressive weight it once was. It was a silence of resolution, of acceptance. She had won. Emily took a step forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, each step measured, deliberate. She was no longer the woman who had cowered in the shadows, the one who had been invisible to the world. She had found her place. She had reclaimed her power, and now nothing could take it from her. The Duke turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. The cold, calculating expression that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something unreadable. A flicker of uncertainty? Regret? Emily couldn't quite tell. But there was no mistaking it. This man, this Duke, the one who had held all the cards, had now been brought to a place where he could not control her, could not dominate her. "You've changed," the Duke said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something unexpected. It wasn't anger or even frustration. It was something softer, something that might have been respect. Or was it admiration? Emily didn't know. She didn't care. She had earned this moment. "You think you've won?" he asked, his tone barely above a whisper. But there was no challenge in it. There was no force. His words were empty now, hollow. "I didn't think I had to win," Emily replied, her voice steady, clear. "I simply had to stop playing by your rules." The Duke's gaze softened, just for a moment, and Emily could see the shift in him. The realization that the power he had wielded so easily had evaporated. It wasn't her that had changed, it was him. He had underestimated her from the start, and now, he was paying the price. Emily took another step forward, her breath steady. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of what he could do, of the world he had built, of the force he had been. She had already taken that world apart piece by piece. She had stripped him of his control, and in doing so, she had found her own. "You don't control me," she said, her voice unwavering, strong. "And you never will again." The Duke's expression darkened, and for a moment, Emily thought he might argue, might try to reclaim what was left of his authority. But he didn't. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her with something like resignation in his eyes. He had lost. The room around them remained silent, the guests watching the final act unfold before their eyes. Emily knew the battle for control was over, but she also knew that this was just the beginning of something new. A new chapter in her life, one where she was in control. No longer a shadow in the corner, no longer the woman dismissed and overlooked. No longer the pawn in a game she hadn't asked to play. She was the player now. The Duke, once so towering and impervious, now seemed smaller, diminished by his own inability to hold on to what he had taken for granted. She had broken free, and as she stood there, facing him, she realized something. She hadn't just won his respect. She had won her freedom. The Duke took a slow breath, his posture shifting, but he didn't speak. There was nothing more to say. The power had shifted, and with it, everything had changed. Emily turned away from him, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet strength that came from knowing she had finally found herself. The room was still, the weight of everything that had just happened hanging in the air, but Emily didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already won. And in that victory, she knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again.